find the time to wine and dine. Your bitch is better than me. Ooh, ooh, this shit is trash, but I'ma give it right on back, 'cause that's what I've been getting from you here lately. You've been out on the block acting crazy, doing your thing, and then you turn around and blame it on the moon, just 'cause you're feeling blue. How much can a heart take when feelings change like phases of the moon? Ooh, you found me in a hard space. Hey, hey, hey. Say it done it. No pain, no pleasure. Your lie took it all. Ooh, you take my money and I don't get it back. Ooh, no patience, running out, honey. Oh yeah. Ooh, this shit is trash. I'ma give it right on back, 'cause that's what I've been getting from you here lately. You been out of your mind, telling lies, loving me blind. Talk about we should take time. How you go and call it good news? Oh, 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 'cause you feel it, yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, oh. How much can
One concept that it is very important to understand is the difference between repression and transmutation, right? Because you got to understand that energy cannot be created nor destroyed, right? Through the way that we think and through the thoughts that we entertain. Understand that what you feed will grow and what you starve will die. And this is where I do believe somewhat in the concept of manifestation and the law of attraction, because I get into these concepts. I've lived them, I've utilized them. This is how faith has worked for me within my spiritual belief. But a lot of that came through understanding that to the pure, all things are pure, but to the defiled, all things are defiled. Right? But it's very important to understand the difference between repression and transmutation. Now, the foundational thing to understand is that there has to be a baseline level, and to do it consciously, there has to be a certain level of integration of the shadow in order to do it. Right? You got to integrate the shadow in order to transmute energy. Right? But there has to be a baseline level of desirability when it comes to the outcome and when it comes to the process of that outcome. Right? That means that whatever you're trying to transmute a desire or an energy towards, it has to be attractive enough according to your level of discipline and according to your level of willpower, right? Because if you don't have enough willpower or enough discipline to push yourself in a certain direction long enough for that to form a habit, and for that habit to form creating a feedback loop, then the intrinsic desire for that other option has to be high enough to contend with the choice that it's not going to be as preferential as far as the outcome, as far as the logic of that decision that you make. Very important to understand. So there has to be a baseline level of safety. So with that safety comes freedom, right? And when it comes to a baseline level of safety and a baseline level of desire, right? This and a baseline level of attraction. This is called the baseline principle. Very important to understand. So it's kind of like, and this is where you explore the depths of the duplicity of your mentality when it comes to integrating the shadow. One example I like to give with this is when it comes to eating food, right? How your diet is set up. As human beings, we have a desire for things that are not as healthy, and we have a desire for things that are as healthy. Now, if taste is a high enough point, right, then you have an unhealthy choice and you have a healthy choice. If your healthy choice tastes just as good, if not better, than the unhealthy choice, then it'll be much easier to transmute that energy, and also to recognize when you have self-sabotaging or self-harming tendencies when it comes to what you do. And this is where BDSM can be a great thing. Just Dom subdynamics, right? Because if your desire for the approval or your respect for someone is high enough, and there's accountability involved, and there's enough safety and honesty to where you know that you will tell the truth about what you do, then it kind of creates a situation where the desire for the validation that comes from someone that you respect can override the level of validation you will receive, or the level of a dopamine hit you'll receive from doing something that's harmful to yourself, right? So there's rewards and there's consequences. But we got to understand the difference between repression and transmutation, right? Now, the thing to understand about repression is that when you repress things, it pushes whatever you desire into your shadow. And through pushing it into your shadow, you're pushing it into an area of your consciousness, into your psyche, that's outside of the conscious understanding of what choices you're making. And by doing that, it doesn't get rid of that desire. It causes you to make micro decisions that push you in that direction, right? That's a very important concept to understand. It'll push you to make micro decisions and micro choices that will push you closer to what you desire, right? But in a way that won't be beneficial ultimately to your overall bottom line, right? So let's say we're talking about food. Let's say you like Skittles, and let's say there's Skittles and then there's salad, right? There's a big spectrum of things in between here, right? I like Skittles too. But let's say you like to eat some double fried pork chops, smothered in gravy, extra hot sauce, covered in a whole bunch of different shit that's just gonna clog your arteries, with an extra double serving of rice, you know what I mean? And if you're already dealing with health issues, and you're susceptible to like diabetes, to cardiovascular disease, you're susceptible to having clogged arteries, you're susceptible to having spikes in your insulin, like because of diabetes running in your family, which will lead to inflammation in your joints, which will lead to a lowering of your energy levels, which will lead to a low cut space inadvertently, which will lead to sometimes a lessening or a spike in your sex drive, or leading to just a lack of energy and a low level of mood. This type of thing can even lead to exacerbating symptoms of depression. So what you got to understand is that when you have a duplicitous mentality, or a mentality that is repressed, that desire to engage in those behaviors will subconsciously present themselves through behaviors that feel addictive, right? And we all have our vices, but we have to weigh our vices out. Can you delve in your vices without it negatively affecting you on a level that you feel like the worth and the cost is not worth it? Now understand, if you feed into your vices too much, then the momentum will pick up too much for you to be able to stop it. So oftentimes what you have to do is to be able to first slow down the momentum before you have the capacity to truly transmute. But if you have the capacity to transmute, the higher your capacity for transmutation, the more momentum can be built up and that energy can be redirected. So let me break down the different levels and the different areas in which sexual energy transmutation takes place, right? First thing we need to understand is there's the dominant ego and there's the submissive ego, right? So this is more than just sex, but sexual energy is the creative energy. A lot of things come from this place. So I'll break it down for you. So we have the dominant ego and the submissive ego. Dominant ego is things that feel like they validate you, right? Things that make you feel valuable, things that make you feel attractive, things that make you feel powerful, based off of whatever your ego is set up to value in that particular way. Validation is dominant ego validation, right? Then you have the submissive ego, which is pouring out of yourself. Now understand that your attachment will come through the pouring out of the submissive ego. So protect your submissive ego, right? So things that just give you pleasure, that you exchange power or resources in exchange for, that is where your submissive ego is. So whatever you give validation to because of how much you value it or how attracted to it you are, is where your submissive ego is. Now the dominant and the submissive ego, they take place on 3 different levels, right? The 3 different levels are social, sexual, and self-preservation. Now, understand that when I say social, sexual, and self-preservation, I'm speaking in regards to the instinctual variance of the Enneagram. I'm not speaking in regards to social and sexual, just only the sexual level being sexual. No, there could be sexual that takes place on all 3 levels of the instinctual and variant, right? So what does this mean? When it comes to the social level, there is casual sex or casual validation, social media praise, strangers or people who are acquaintances who give you validation, and then also people who have a factor of novelty surrounding them and a factor of mystery surrounding them and a lack of true intimacy. This is where oftentimes limerence may take place. This is oftentimes where curiosity is greater than realized chemistry. On the sexual level is where you have the realized chemistry. That's where you have intimacy. That's where you have a greater level of safety that's based on reality versus safety that's based on a lack of investment. Very important to understand. Very important to understand. So when we grasp this concept, there's the social level, which would be casual sex partners, random validation or compliments you get from people. That could be to a certain level, that could be porn or seeing someone you're attracted to online or in person, and someone treating you in a way as if they're attracted to you online or in person, but not being someone you truly know, right? That's the social level. Then we have the sexual level. And for me, understand that my channel is mostly revolves around primary partnerships. So whether you're monogamous or non-monogamous, I don't really believe in strict monogamy, but I also don't believe in strict anarchist relationships. I believe that you have your primary partnership, and based off of what is sacred in that relationship, based off of what your submissive egos are related to and your capacity to transmute energy or control that, and based off of what needs aren't met in that situation, if the needs that aren't met are ones that don't conflict with the boundaries of that relationship dynamic, then you outsource those needs as long as it doesn't take food out of the mouth of your partner in order to do it. Right? So let's say I'm dealing with a woman. If my woman is a primary partner, then I may still sleep with other women, but I'm not going to do it in a way that takes food out of her mouth, as far as spending money that I would spend on her to do it, spending time that I would spend on her to do it, emotional, social, or financial validation. Those are the things that stroke a woman's dominant ego. I don't give those things away unless it's in excess to what the woman I'm dealing with already is getting, what she already has earned, or unless her needs are already met, and then I'm going beyond that to deal with somebody else without taking food out of her mouth. That's from the submissive ego, right? What's masculine submissive? That's being transactional. So really, to play that role of outsourcing, you have to either do it through feminine dominance, right? Or you have to do it through masculine dominance. But you should not take a submissive role outside of your primary partnership. Very important to understand. Not in the level of your submissive ego. That's not good. Right? So, but let's say we're talking about the dominant ego. Or let's say my dominant ego when it comes to receiving validation. Or when it comes to having sexual access to women. Well, if there are certain things that the woman I'm with needs sexually, I'm not going to allow my dominant ego to get overstimulated, to get love bombed, to the extent that I lose a frame of reference of what circumstance I'm in or the value of the relationships that I'm in. Because that's really oftentimes where the limerence can come in at. And I've experienced it before, but when I've experienced it, I was able to recognize love bombing, and I had enough experience with it that I knew how not to try and be transactional with love or affection or attention or validation in order to gain sexual access to women. So even if, let's say, I was in a position in my life when I was younger where I wasn't accustomed to women showing a certain level of sexual desire and attraction towards me, and when I first experienced that, it was something that just blew my mind, and it gave me a sense of validation to where it started to paint rose-tinted glasses around the woman who gave me that experience. Because being desired on an intrinsic level sexually without the inclusion of needing to be desired on, or without the inclusion of an expectation of a non-sexual return on investment, it strokes your dominant ego on an intrinsic level, because you don't feel like the person, you don't feel entitled towards that person reciprocating or giving you that type of validation. So the masculine submissive exercise of self-control is very easy to catch you up in when it comes to that whole limerent thing. Feminine dominance and the masculine submissive exercise of self-control. Right? So that could be a love bomb, or that could be a very measured stall out of validation that feels intrinsic, although it may not truly be. It may be, but it may not be. Not on a level of full desire. Now, when we're talking about integrated relationships, somebody who just wants you sexually or somebody who just wants you non-sexually is not going to be enough. Not for a long-term relationship. So as a man, sometimes you mature beyond that point of feeling like you only want a woman who only wants you sexually. But oftentimes you have to have that experience first before you can appreciate a woman who desires you on both levels. A secret to understand about sex, and I'm not going to get too deep into this on this video because I want to make a separate video. But, and this is going to go into this video some, but when it comes to long-term relationships versus casual relationships, a woman is not going to pull out of her non-sexual energy and transmute that into sexual energy to meet your sexual needs in a casual sex relationship unless she wants more. Unless she's in limerence, unless she's extremely insecure and desires your non-sexual validation, she's not going to pour out of her own non-sexual energy in order to meet your sexual needs depending on her level of sexual attraction. That would be a selfish thing about her own sexual needs. But once she starts transmuting non-sexual energy into sexual energy in order to meet your sexual needs, then if it's because she's in a height of being in her emotions that time, when she gets out of her emotions, she's going to feel like she gave up too much. Right? If you make her feel safe again, she'll come back around. But for the most part, watch my video on the bait and switch to break that down. In a long-term relationship, two people aren't going to do 100% of what they want to do 100% of the time. And because of that, there's going to be times where you're both going to do things for each other in good faith, or not do things in good faith for someone else in order to respect the sanctity and the sacredness of your relationship, even if you have the freedom to do those things. That's good faith, right? Like, if you have a woman and she's helping extra on the bills, in good faith, you shouldn't be spending money that you could be spending on the bills where she's helping you with the bills to take another woman out, especially when you're not taking her out as much as you used to. Remember how much can a heart take by Yella and Lucky Day, where she's like, how do you find the time to wine and dine your bitch is better than me? You shouldn't be giving attention to other women if you have a primary partner in a way where if your woman isn't already getting enough attention, now it feels as if you are being submissive to another person above your primary partner. For both men and women, you shouldn't show a greater level of submissiveness towards somebody outside of your relationship dynamic unless the person that you're dealing with is a cuckold or a cuck queen and they're attracted to that. Outside of that, you're out of line. Right? Or unless they did something so wrong, you're getting your get back. Right? In those situations, you should be able to be honest about it and they can accept it as that's their price that they have to pay to deal with that for the shit that they did. Right? But even then, you want to avoid that in most instances if at all possible. Right? So when it comes to the transmutation of energy, you have to understand certain things. There's the social level, then there's the sexual level, right? Then there's the self-preservation level. Remember, this is based on the instinctual variance from the Enneagram. So the self-preservation level is your capacity to self-soothe. This is your own personal security. Now, there's security, competence, and compatibility that takes place on all three different levels. So when it comes to security, how secure are you? There's masculine and feminine security, right? Masculine security relates to the dominant ego. Feminine security relates to the submissive ego. Very important to understand. And this relates to all three levels. So when it comes to the dominant ego, when it comes to the self-preservation level, it's your capacity to self-soothe and self-validate, as well as your capacity to self-please. So if we're talking purely on a sexual level, masturbation would be self-preservation, right? But also celibacy would also be self-preservation. Transmuting your sexual energy into non-sexual energy so that you can do things that strengthen your own ability to self-soothe, your own self-discipline, your own masculine security, right? That's on the self-preservation level. I remember there's a time in my life where I was celibate, and I was celibate for religious reasons, because I believed in certain traditional values when it came to Christianity that I no longer believe in, about premarital sex being a sin, being afraid of hell. I don't even believe in the traditional view of hell like I used to. Now I'm probably borderline conditionalist, borderline hopeful universalist, but really I'm more of a conditionalist / annihilationist, right? When it comes to my views on like eschatology and soteriology and shit like that, right? That's getting into some more theological type shit, right? But at the point in my life where I was when I was younger, because I viewed premarital sex as inherently sinful, but that was a desire that I had, I didn't understand how to transmute that energy that I had, of all the sexual energy that I had. Listen, I'm a Scorpio. I'm a highly sexual being. And because of that, I had a relationship at the time, and it caused me to desexualize the woman in my life. Before then, I only had eyes for her. But through desexualizing her in my mind, it created just by proxy, it created a Madonna whore complex where more and more women around me became more and more attractive. And with her, she repressed her sexual energy through binge eating, right? Think about the vagus nerve, or the vagus nerve. I'm not sure if it's vagus or vagus, but the vagus nerve is connected, like, I believe from the brainstem somewhere up around the throat area, and it goes down to like where the uterus is. And when a woman's singing, when a woman's eating, when a woman's laughing, these things stimulate the vagus nerve, and through stimulating the vagus nerve, they create a feeling of being soothed, right? They create a feeling of being soothed. So sometimes a woman can be repressing her sexual energy, and then she compensates for that lack of feeling full from getting dick in her with stuff in her face, right? Compensates for the feeling of that relinquishing of control and that release during sex. And by repressing the sexual aspect, it can turn into a binge eating disorder, right? That's very important to understand. Sometimes it can even turn into different types of eating disorders that are connected to levels of sexual repression. So that kind of created a double whammy, right? Where instead of me using the transmutation of not walking in my sexual energy, I was repressing it, which led to partially a Madonna whore complex, and it also led to a porn addiction that I had overcame. But I didn't overcome it through just telling myself not to watch it. I didn't have the willpower in order to not do it for forever. So anytime I would open up that door, it would just create a Pandora's box and an avalanche where I would like miss class to go masturbate in the bathroom, or I would go to a demonic warfare conference and then throw my phone on the ground outside because I just couldn't keep myself off those porn sites, right? It's like you have to have an outlet for your energy. You need to transmute that shit. Like if it's not a good idea, you need to transmute it, or you need to rework through whatever your value system is to make sure that it is one that allows you to have outlets for your desires, and put your life into that trajectory, right? So when it comes to sexual energy transmutation, it works on several different levels, right? There's the social sexual self-preservation, and there's the dominant and the submissive on both sides, right? So this works in different ways, how sexual energy transmutation works. Dominant ego validation is energy that comes in. Submissive ego things are things that go out. Now, in order for us to feel like we're in alignment, and in order for us to be comfortable with ourselves and to feel fulfilled and to feel happy, all three of these levels to a certain extent need to have a cycle of energy that keeps us from being drained down to empty. And this is where cup space comes in. Depending on what cup space you're in, it's going to create the mechanisms for how your mindset is going to work. You can have a mindset that you want to be in, that you think sounds good, but unless the cycle of energy within your life keeps you in a high enough cup space, you won't be able to operate out of a higher mentality than you currently are at, right? So keep in mind there's the low cup spaces, which are masculine, submissive, and feminine dominant, right? Both of those cup spaces come from a lack of integrating the shadow, right? So when you're masculine submissive, you don't view yourself as intrinsically desirable, or you don't feel yourself as intrinsically desirable with the person that you're interacting with. Therefore, you are trading validation from your submissive ego in order to gain a reciprocation of validation to your dominant ego. But both of these are going to be both of these are going to be messed up. Both of these are going to be corrupted for a lot of different reasons. Right? They're going to be corrupted by unconscious things that are beneath the surface. This right here works in a variety of ways, right? Like when you're lacking in masculine security, but you are a dominant individual by nature, then once you feel triggered, you're going to be willing to lie, to steal, to force, to manipulate someone rather than having dominant empathy towards their capacity to have feminine security enough to be receptive to you directly communicating what you desire to do, right? That's how feminine dominance works. This is where a lot of narcissism comes in, a lot of things come in at, right? But the flip side, what the feminine dominance is attracted to is the masculine submissive, because what you're attracted to is the challenge of overcoming those boundaries, right? And those two are the flip side of each other. So typically, if you're a masculine submissive man, you may have a feminine dominant anima, which means you'll be attracted to feminine dominant women. And those feminine dominant women you're attracted to, it's like the only way for you to experience moments of the feminine submissive as a man is through a woman manipulating you, through love bombing you, pouring enough energy into you for you to feel as if it's intrinsic for you to interact with her non-sexually, or your just attraction's high enough, right? But then she has to make you feel as if you're more dominant than you are. Or let's say when you're masculine submissive as a man, and then a woman's operating out of feminine dominance, then that gives you enough pain, enough frustration for you to overcome different things and to then operate out of masculine dominance out of frustration. Right? So you'll have short pockets of being in a high cup space depending on where your cup is. Right? Very important to understand. So the next thing to understand through this is you got the high cup space. Well, you got the medium cup space, which is masculine, submissive, exercise, and self-control. I'm not going to talk about that too much, but I can. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. So when it comes to the masculine, submissive, exercise, and self-control, that is where you are operating from a place of using intrinsic desire and intrinsic reward, limiting how much of your submissive ego you're pouring out, and then also limiting how much dominant ego validation you're allowing to affect you on a level of stroking your ego. So when you're doing a masculine, submissive, exercise, and self-control as a man, you're pretty much playing the role of being the friendly guy with the woman who you'd be open to having sex with. You have to lessen how much you'd want to have sex with her in order to not cross that line prematurely, right? And to respect that boundary. But you'd also have to lower how much you want to interact with her non-sexually to just when you have time and out of your excess. That way you don't jump up into the feminine submissive space when you don't have the energy for it. And then that turns into feminine dominance if you feel as if the individual is taking advantage of you during that time, during that process. Right? So it's important to understand that. And it's the same thing with the masculine, submissive, exercise, and self-control woman. You know, you have to, she might be having casual sex with a man, but only see him when she's free. It has to be in subjection to her primary partner, after her primary partner's needs are already met. It has to be a situation where she's not allowing him to give her a bunch of emotional validation that affects her on a level to where she feels validated and wants to and feels attached to that validation. It also has to be a scenario in which, through interacting in these particular ways, the woman's pretty much trying to get the dominant ego validation, even though she's doing it through she doesn't crave it that much, right? She doesn't need it. So she might be able to fuck with a guy here and there, but just on her own time. She probably limits him, makes him wear a condom, limits certain acts he's willing to do. She stifles her submissiveness to engage in an act because she sees the opportunity for some type of benefit within the sexual experience itself. So that is the masculine submissive exercise of self-control. That's a middle cup space. There is a certain level of intrinsic desire that can be mutual, right? Then you have the high cup space, which is the masculine dominant and the feminine submissive, right? Feminine submissive is intrinsic desire and intrinsic reward that takes place through both the sexual and the non-sexual, but having a higher, or at least a high enough level of desire in the place of, and feminine security in place of the submissive ego, which for a man would be emotional and for a woman would be sexual. And what this does is it creates a scenario by which you're willing to be malleable or feminine or fluid about the way in which you're giving up control in the area of your submissive ego, which means you're willing to pursue or to be receptive, right? But then also on the non-sexual level, or on the secondary level being your dominant ego, in the area of that, you're also willing to pour out of yourself in that area as well, in order to be open enough to see if the possibility of creating a positive feedback loop and a sustainable cycle of energy is present, right? So a feminist submissive woman may engage with a man in casual sex, but she may also do extra things for him, like clean up, find ways to make herself available, spend money on the guy, go out with the guy, be intimate with the guy, or crave to be intimate, not feel like she needs that in order to enjoy the experience, but it feels intrinsic and organic on a level to where it feels like real intimacy is coming from that experience. And then from that place, if enough energy is poured out over a period of time, and the masculine dominant on the other side of that feminine submissive has a program, has a plan, has a high enough baseline level of attraction to be able and willing to take that woman further, then as far as he's willing to go, as far as she's willing to put in, and as far as he's willing to go, then they can go there. That's masculine dominant with feminine submissive, right? Then we have the overflowing cup spaces, which are the integrated masculine, the integrated feminine, and the masculine dominant exercise and self-control, right? So I basically broke down 4 different cup spaces. You have low cup space, mid cup space, high cup space, and then you have the overflowing cup space. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into the overflowing cup space today, but I probably will need to a little bit for the sake of understanding the cycle of energy and understanding why it's an overflowing cup space. So I'll give a couple examples, right? So let's say you're the integrated masculine and there's a cycle of energy. When you're the integrated masculine or the integrated feminine, you have such a high cup when it comes to the self-preservation level, right? You have so much security and the self-preservation level that you have both masculine and feminine security. And then you get to choose which one is going to be necessary for that moment. So if you have a high level of feminine security as a masculine individual, then let's say you're in a monogamous relationship, right? If your woman isn't in a space to have sex with you, then you have the capacity to logically look at the situation without needing to get instructions from her about what exactly you need to do to be able to identify and observe conversations that you've had, and then to, if she's rejecting you sexually, you can take your sexual energy, transmute that back into self-soothing, and then from that self-soothing place, then you're able to use that sexual energy and transmute it into work that you're going to put into yourself to actually make yourself more attractive to your partner, to be able to provide a certain level of safety where things begin to naturally occur for a woman who may be in the masculine submissive space. That's what the integrated masculine is able to do. So the integrated masculine kind of creates a transmutation of energy without the woman having to actively do it. Because, like I said, there's going to be a baseline safety, and there has to be a baseline level of attractiveness. So one, you can work to make yourself more attractive, but two, you create a certain level of safety. Like something an integrated masculine man may do is he may be with a woman who's actually broken the principles and the structure of their relationship dynamic and cheated on her and had an affair. But rather than trying to tell the woman to stop having the affair or trying to convince her that it's not a good idea, appealing to her logic where there's a big gap between her logic and emotions, the integrated masculine man may lean into the affair, right? May lean into the limerent situation that she's in, and then create so much safety that her sexual desires start to go towards him as long as she isn't, and then without putting pressure on her to do it, and then to focus on quality instead of quantity, and then eventually the majority of that sexual energy will start to transmute back into the primary partner. That's something that the integrated masculine can do. That's something that the integrated masculine can do. The integrated feminine is somebody who's on an even higher cup space than the feminine submissive, because the feminine submissive oftentimes is going to be fixated on a particular person, but that particular person is going to be whoever excites them and is the most competent at that period of time. So a feminine submissive is typically not going to be able to choose who they experience feminine submissiveness with the first time. It's going to be a spiritual choice or an intuitive choice, but it may not always be the right choice. Sometimes it's going to be based off of reality, but most of the time it's going to be a little bit delusional. And this is why there's the integrated feminine. The integrated feminine has enough in her cup to be able to use her mind to think herself into a feminine submissive space, while also being able to influence the anima and the program of maybe a masculine dominant or a feminine dominant to where they raise up into a space where they're more understanding. That's what the integrated feminine can do. Now, why am I bringing this up when I'm talking about sexual energy transmutation? Most people are not going to be the integrated feminine and the integrated masculine. The integrated masculine could be like Uncle Iroh off of Avatar: The Last Airbender. You know, the integrated masculine is the idea of this gentle giant, and not the pushover gentle giant, but the true wisdom, right? The level of the anima development that reaches the stage of Sophia, which is the wisdom of God. Because remember, there's 4 stages of the anima. There's Eve, there's Helen, there's Mary, and there's Sophia. So when we're talking about sexual energy transmutation, the integrated is able to transmute energy from their self-preservation into their sexual without their cup getting depleted and without there having to be an immediate positive feedback loop, right? So without there having to be an immediate positive feedback loop, there's such an overflowing cup on the self-preservation level that the safety can stay established, and then it creates a positive feedback loop based off of the safety rather than the competency, rather than the reality of the situation, right? Most men are not that. And I'll say this, most masculine submissive individuals have this idealistic idea of someone who is on the integrated level before they meet them. Chances are you're not going to get that. Chances are you're not going to come around that. Chances are, if you're in a low cup space and you're dealing with somebody who's in an overflowing cup space, it's because they found a way to get themselves there through recognizing that there is nothing that they could do to improve things with you, but loving you enough to stay there anyways. Chances are that's how that happens. Because most of the time, somebody who is in an integrated space is not looking for somebody who's in a low cup space. Right? Understand what I'm saying? Very important to understand, because there's a price for premature integration. Right? Like, the price for premature integration is that, like, let's say a woman falls in love with your heart. Right? She falls in love with your heart and isn't integrated in her shadow. Then when she falls in love with your heart, that's going to be related to her social programming. And with that being connected to her social programming, that's the gentleman aspect of her split animus. And that gentleman aspect of her split animus means that she associates you with what she deems should be a good man. And because of that, when she wants to truly step outside of her sexual energy, step outside of her social programming, her true sexual desires are going to be related to the bad boy, right? It's going to be related to the gigolo. It's going to be related to the feeling of taboo, right? Now, if you miss that beginning stage of creating that sustainable cycle of sexual energy within that relationship, where there's excitement, there's intensity, there's novelty, there's these different things involved, then oftentimes a woman's not going to be able to experience that with you if she's already been with you for a long enough time, unless she's transmuting sexual energy. And if she heavily relates to you through her social programming, then she's not going to be willing or able to do it, right? And because of that, even if you're telling her something that's true, she's not going to be in a high enough cup space to truly comprehend or to understand or to implement the things that you're telling her, right? So it just creates a cycle that leads to a further breakdown of the safety through a woman feeling like you don't accept her as she is. But you giving her the love of accepting her as she is in a low cup space would put her into a position where if she doesn't already love herself, if she isn't already attracted to herself, if she isn't already confident, then she's not going to be ready for where her desires truly go when her cup gets high enough to tap into the feminine submissive, right? So really the goal is that if somebody is in a low cup space and you already have a primary partner, that when you reach a higher cup space, that you channel and transmute this energy into your primary partner. And oftentimes you either have to separate yourself pretty much altogether from different things. Like either you're separating yourself, and if you're not separating yourself and being pretty much a homebody, then you may find yourself in a situation where you're going to have to learn how to transmute energy, or you are going to utterly sabotage and destroy your relationship. Now, just think about the word transmutation. It sounds like I'm talking about witchcraft. It sounds like I'm saying something that's very esoteric and dark and occultish. Not necessarily. I'm just talking about psychological models, how the mind works, how the energy flows, right? So there are ways in which these things can happen, but oftentimes it's going to take place through transmutation, right? So let me also talk about the dom sub dynamics of having multiple partners or being a partner with multiple partners, right? There's a certain respect you show towards your primary partnership. If you do not show that respect towards your primary partnership with your emotional priorities, your sexual priorities, your financial priorities, your social priorities, then what's going to happen is you're going to take that cycle of energy on the sexual level, and if you're feeling low on the social validation that you're receiving, and that becomes a higher priority, then you're going to pull energy out of your sexual relationship and then pour that into a social relationship. And through this is where we create the gentleman gigolo complex, where a woman has the nice guy and then she has the bad boy. The bad boy receives more dominant ego validation, right? For his own ego. And the gentleman does not receive as much dominant ego validation. That comes from an intrinsic place, but has the responsibilities of pouring into the woman's cup on a dominant level, which means that anytime, let's say we're talking about a submissive. A submissive cannot serve two masters, right? A submissive cannot serve two masters. Now there's caveats to this, like if a woman is masculine submissive, exercising self-control, who just likes the idea of getting into hookup culture and BDSM, she's a no-limit soldier, and she's just dealing with service tops rather than dominants who have power dynamics, power exchanges that go outside of the bedroom, then sometimes that can work for a woman. But even then, eventually, with enough intimacy involved and enough intensity involved, somebody's going to pull away from the pack, right? It's kind of how it works. Typically, a woman who's doing a masculine submissive exercise and self-control has to know how to cut a man off if the dick is too good or if she likes him too much, right? And if she doesn't, then she's going to get caught up, right? So let's put it like this. If you have, let's say, I'm going to give 3 different variations of relationship dynamics that involve 3 people, right? Or call it the 3-body problem. So let's say there's one dominant with two submissives. So if you're a dominant and you have two submissives, then if you have masculine security, as in principles and structure that you stick to, then you may have certain principles that you adhere to, that you stick to. Meaning that you may say, okay, cool, we got tenure, we got right of first refusal, we have what position is someone in, and then using your principles to determine who receives dominant ego validation from you, who receives from your submissive ego based off of the work that they've put in and how they qualify. But once you get too much into making it about looks, once you get too much into making it about things that a person had before you met them rather than things that you taught them, or things that they do for you, then you can start to veer off into more of a feminine dominant lane. But if you're a dominant and you understand this, then you can manage having multiple submissives. And with these multiple submissives, you're running pretty much the same program, or you're tailor making these programs to them. But the price of being a dominant is that you have to be masculine, meaning that you have to be principled in order to operate effectively, meaning that you're lessening how much pleasure and how much emotional stimulation that you're receiving in order to stay in a logical mindset and to be able to look at the overall landscape of what's going on, to look ahead, to plan, to set expectations, to set the pace, and to control what's going on, right? Because to be dominant is the primary giver of pleasure and primary receiver of control. Submissive is the primary giver of control, primary receiver of pleasure, right? When you're masculine, they say women are better at multitasking, and there may be some truth to that, but when you're masculine, you have to think about a lot of different factors. You may be tunnel vision on a particular model of doing things as your principle, as your core values, but for the most part, you have to think about a lot more factors versus someone who's feminine, who may have a better capacity to multitask at one period of time, or who may have a higher capacity for the experience of pleasure, but at the same time, they need to focus into a masculine figure who's going to provide structure for that feminine energy to flow, right? So if you're masculine and you're dominant, then you can manage having multiple partners without losing your priorities, right? Now let's say that you have two women, then those two women may compete if neither one of them are in a certain space or position. Or it may be a situation where you have your primary partner and then the other relationships are offshoots of that. But if you're a masculine dominant, and then just because somebody's new or novel or more attractive, you're doing more for them than someone who's already on your team and more dedicated to you, who's done more for you, then you start moving in a way where you're disrupting your stable. Your rotation is off. Your priorities are out of whack, right? Now let's say we got, and limerence is typically what does this. You have to understand the chemicals and the hormones that go on throughout the body and in the mind in these type of scenarios. You got to understand it, right? So let's say you're submissive. If you're submissive, you can't serve two masters, which means you're either taking energy from one and giving it to the other, or taking energy from the other and giving it to the one. But to think that you're going to be able to not have the energy of multiple partners affect the dynamics between each other is not realistic, right? So that means that either it's the gentleman and the gigolo complex, or you're transmuting energy as one man who's pimping and one man who's simping, right? Pimping a trick or pimping a simp, right? So what does that mean? If it's a pimp and a simp, or let's say it's a Mac and a simp. So let me break that down for you a little bit. So a Mac is going to be more so a man who's a player, who says dick is not free. That's part of his motto. So when he's interacting with a woman, he's able to use his mouthpiece and the value that he adds to a woman in order to get resources from something that she's doing non-sexually. Right? That's more so Mac, right? Between your mouthpiece, your sex game, your vibe, your essence, and your program, your principles, a woman is willing to invest in you non-sexually. Right? Now, you also have the simp. So a simping is going to be a guy who is investing in a woman. This is a beta male orbiter who's investing in a woman in hopes of maybe receiving sexual access to the woman, or is overvaluing her non-sexually, overvaluing her based on how much she's actually done for him. Right? So that's a simp. Or a man who keeps pursuing a woman who doesn't want him, that's a simp. Just a man overvaluing a woman and not valuing her based off of what she's actually done with and or for him, but just because she's attractive, or just because of the projection of his animal. Right? That's the simp. So if you're a Mac and you're dealing with a woman, then oftentimes you're going to create a judgment-free zone where you create safety. Through that creation of safety, there's also a certain level of structure. But through that creation of safety and already a pre-established level of sexual attraction is high enough, then the woman will receive social level of dominant ego validation, sometimes through the game that you give her, and through receiving that social level non-sexual validation, dominant validation, which would be emotional, social, or financial. This pours into her, into the self-preservation, making her feel more secure within herself if she's insecure, right, and just needs a boost or needs the confirmation of her desirability. And it also is something that she can pour that energy back into the sexual. Meaning, let's say you're going out to a bar, and a guy at the bar wants to buy your woman drinks. She takes the drink, or she looks to you first and it's like, all right, cool, do what you do. And in order to show that she appreciates you giving her the freedom, or allowing her the freedom to be able to receive outside validation without you feeling disrespected, she will give you a drink as well. Either she'll buy a drink for you herself, or she will give you the drink that the man bought. Like, let's say she doesn't drink. That is a transmutation of energy from the social into the sexual, right? Now, something to understand is this. If you as a man are pouring into a woman who is insecure, who's depressed, who's dealing with different things mentally that hurt her capacity to maintain and sustain her own level of security and self-image, then her cup may be like a bottomless pit, or feel like a bottomless pit when it comes to how much validation she needs that feels intrinsic. So she may not value your validation the same if she feels like you're validating her because you love her. But if you speak to her directly on the basis, the foundation of where she is, she also won't feel validated because you're going to tell her you're not good enough. And this is how you avoid the glow-up principle, but this is also something that can kill safety. So when a woman receives social validation, then what this can do is start to help repair how she sees herself to an extent. But if it's like a bottomless pit and she needs too much of it, then eventually she'll get attached to the validation that she's receiving and then become willing to pour energy back out to get it. So therapy, meditation, prayer life, your spirituality, masturbation, all these things can become part of the self-preservation. Now, it's different ways this works right here, right? Different ways that it works. Right? Because understand that even within the sexual level itself of the instinctual variance and the cycle of energy, a cycle of energy can get off on either side due to a lack of receiving or experiencing an adequate level of security, right? So let's say, depending on where a woman's cup is, it's going to affect at times the level of sexual attraction she's going to be able to display towards you in an ongoing relationship. Now, for a casual sex relationship, a woman can simply have a spike in her libido to live that out, to have her a fling or to have her a one-night stand, to release that energy, oftentimes maybe through the mana principle if she's celibate, or if she mostly doesn't engage in casual sex, to get that off, to keep it pushing, and then to be cool. She gets caught up, right? So that's what the masculine submissive exercise self-control is for the mana principle. Don't do the mana principle if you got a primary partner unless they're a cuck or a cuck queen, right? I'm just put that like that. But through the releasing of that energy, it keeps that energy from rotting, like manna from heaven in the Old Testament, right? And by keeping that from rotting, she gets to sustain that cycle of energy and keep flourishing and growing in her self-preservation level. Cool. But something else to understand about these scenarios is this. In a long-term relationship, both the sexual and the non-sexual feed into each other for that feedback loop, which means that both people need to feel both sexually desired and to feel sexual desire, and both people need to feel non-sexually desired and to feel non-sexual desire, and both of them need to feel somewhat either on an intrinsic level, or there needs to be a strong enough foundation in one area to create the feedback loop. And the person who's the most dominant and masculine needs to be the person who's in control of the feedback loop, because if a more feminine person is in control of the feedback loop, then they will be subject to pouring the non-sexual, they'll be subject to pouring the sexual level, right, of the instinctual variance, pouring that energy out towards the social level, which is where the glow up principle comes from. Watch my video on the glow up principle. I was watching a video recently about this woman who lost 100 pounds, or lost like 180 pounds or 100 pounds or whatever it was, and when she lost that weight, she finally felt attractive. She didn't trust, she had a great husband, but he wasn't fully dominant like that, and she wasn't used to being out in the streets. So when she started receiving attention from new men, this became like a drug to her, and she used plausible deniability, didn't understand how to transmute that energy. So rather than being more available to her man for appreciating the fact that he gave her the freedom to go do that, instead of being honest with him through that safety that's created to express what's going on in her mind and what's going on in her body, and having a baseline level of attraction to him that was high enough to transmute the sexual energy back into him, it led into a limerent affair that caused her to destroy her marriage due to her not being accustomed to that value of validation. Now, there's different ways to increase the value of validation, and there's different ways to increase the level of sexual attraction. You can use kinks, fetishes, BDSM, different stuff like that, learning visualization, interoception, increasing your attraction to different aspects of your partner's body, fixating on them, watching porn of people who you're very attracted to with similar bodily features, and then similar scenarios and narratives, using that narrative to attach on a self-preservation level your sexual attraction, making that something that's about yourself, but then also making that something sacred that you just share with your partner, and that creates a greater level of safety through that being something you're sharing directly with your partner. Then boom, you have a higher level of attraction to your partner on a sexual level. There you go. And it also creates a higher level of non-sexual attraction because you have something that's sacred between you that you share with one another. So you got to watch out for men who like to plant flags. I'm a flag planter, and I'm also a serial digmatizer. I think those things go hand in hand, right? I don't think there's been a time where I was the first man to give a woman a vaginal orgasm for penetration or different types of orgasms where she didn't either shut down or turn up. I don't think there's too much neutrality when it comes to planting flags when a woman's feeling something she's never felt before. Right? It's either self-protection mode or self-abandonment mode. That's one thing that I've noticed. But part of the cost of being that masculine figure, or being that dominant masculine figure, is that you don't allow yourself to get emotionally and or sexually overstimulated, so that when an individual is pouring out to you in that way from that intrinsic place, that you don't take that energy just to pour it out to someone else, that you use loyalty and discipline through your mindset in order to pour back into the individual who is pouring into you. And that's very important to understand. But check this out. You can also use sexual energy transmutation as a dominant. Let's say you're in a high cup space, not an overflowing cup space, but a high cup space. The things that it will take for you to maintain being masculine dominant in a long-term relationship is that either that cycle of energy that leads towards integration has taken place before your cup can get low, or before that woman's limerence wears off and she's no longer maybe as sexually attractive, you no longer have the novelty and excitement factor where the intimacy is involved. Either it has to be established before then and you just have a high enough baseline level of compatibility, or you're going to have to continue to sharpen your sword and to sharpen your game through dealing with other women in order to stay in a masculine dominant state of mind. Because let's say your woman goes through depression, she goes through hormonal issues, let's say she goes through a death in the family, let's say she goes through different things that hurt her capacity to be fully sexually available, but because she's non-sexually invested enough to justify dealing with her, you're still there. If you have to pour too much into her cup, right, just to be loyal to the situation that you're in, eventually you're going to drop down from masculine dominant into a masculine submissive exercise of self-control. And if she doesn't pick up, or if you start to experience covert contracts that she's breaking, or overt contracts that she's breaking as far as how to deal with the situation, or she doesn't catch on quick enough and this situation becomes a problem, then that masculine dominance will drop into masculine submissive exercise and self-control, and that masculine submissive exercise and self-control will eventually drop down into masculine submissiveness or feminine dominance. And then when you're in a low cup space, then the safety is going to begin to die, right? So the safety and the attraction to die. You'll lose a touch and a feel for dominant empathy, right? It's much easier to operate out of that straightforward upfront dominant empathy to assess that, rather than constantly trying to use your senses to feel for it. Because when it comes to safety for a man, that safety is going to come from receiving an adequate level of dominant ego validation. The male and the female ego work different. The dominant and the submissive ego for men and women are flipped. So for a woman, safety in regards to feeling innocent, feeling heard, feeling understood, feeling as if she's doing something that she's cool with, right? Feeling like somebody knows what she truly thinks, feels, desires, and prefers. That intimacy. That is what strokes a woman's dominant ego, probably on the highest level. But the thing to understand about that is that you can have that without someone pouring in things that actually make you feel valued, and you don't actually have to be valued to receive that. And that's where the masculine submissive woman is very attracted to the feminine dominant, or the masculine submissive exercise and self-control, because they give her the semblance of that level of safety without truly being invested in her, right? Very important to understand, because if what you're expressing when you're speaking is that what you desire to do is to break the contract or to break the understanding that you have with an individual, then chances are that person is not going to encourage you to do something that's probably going to harm the relationship if they're honest with you. If someone's not invested in you and don't care that much about you, then they're going to be completely cool with you throwing away your whole relationship or throwing away your entire marriage in order to stroke their ego. And it will stroke their ego even more because of how much you're willing to stretch yourself outside of your own preconceived values and views in order to stroke their ego. Very important to understand. Very important to understand. So when you get this part, this is why the integration of the shadow is so important. If you're a woman who doesn't feel comfortable with consciously taking advantage of a person, right, then you will unconsciously, subconsciously take advantage of the person who's the closest to you in order to receive the validation of someone outside of your relationship. And all the things that you think you won't do, you will end up doing, and then you will have no real excuse. And if you feel unsafe because you're being challenged, or you're being checked, or you're being corrected, or you're being questioned, then your animus will possess you to justify whatever behaviors you need to justify by any means necessary, getting into toxic femininity to protect yourself from a feeling of shame or from a feeling of guilt. Or that feeling of shame and guilt will become sexualized, mixed with that taboo, and then it will exacerbate your desire to do the same thing, just like what I was talking about with food. Let's say you have a feedback loop, and that feedback loop relates to food. Let's say you're looking at depression, body image issues, low energy levels, feeling empty. Let's say you're dealing with these different things. Let's say you use food to soothe that, but it's unhealthy foods, high saturated in fats and sugars and carbs. This leads to inflammation in your muscles and in your joints that makes it more difficult to exercise. Exercise is good for mental health. Let's say that you feel guilty because you ate more than you were supposed to, and because now you feel guilty, you don't accept yourself where you are, it creates a cycle of continuing to do the same thing to make yourself feel better for what you're doing, but it creates the cycle of making you feel worse, making your body image issues worse because you're getting bigger and bigger, and then it creates this really bad cycle, right? So how do you break that cycle? Well, you have to first start with a certain level of self-acceptance, but also having discipline and or a reward system, or finding foods that you can be excited about that present you novelty, but novelty in a way that doesn't hurt what you got going on, doesn't hurt your bottom line and your goals. Very important concept to understand. Very important concept to understand. Right? Because if not, you're going to self-sabotage. And then you're going to probably self-sabotage your relationships as well. You also got to think about mentality. Once you recognize that you're doing things that could be hurtful to somebody, then recognize that if you're doing these things unconsciously, that you need to bring these things into your conscious mind in a way to where you establish boundaries that will help you stop the behavior. But if those behaviors begin to persist, regardless of those boundaries that you put in place, or you see yourself continuing to move in that direction, then you need to bring that shit all the way out your shadow and into your conscious mind, and then channel and direct that. So if you have an inherent desire within you to be rebellious or to manipulate, don't do that. Don't shit where you eat. You get what I'm saying? If you have a desire to be duplicitous, if you're being duplicitous in light of benefiting your primary partnership where your priorities are, then that's kind of like the Mac and the simp, or the pimp and the trick, right? Because you got to understand this. There has to be a context that makes the situation beneficial to the primary partner who's dominant, who's also invested, in order for them to be invested in you while you're interacting with other dominants, or while you're interacting with other men. Which means that you have to be willing to put those other people into a submissive position to you or to him, in order for them to be willing to still share their submissiveness with you, right? So a dominant man is typically not going to want to be in a long-term relationship with a woman who's sleeping with other men, unless this isn't affecting his relationship with her, as long as this isn't adding extra stress to his life as far as what he has to do to maintain the relationship. He's not having to pour energy into her because she's poured energy out into someone else. No, she has to know how to be a real hoe. She has to know how to be a real down bitch. She has to know how to go and get energy, get resources, get validation from other men that makes her feel better, so that she can show up to the relationship better. But no dominant man is going to be cool with being with a woman who is taking energy that he's pouring into her and using that to benefit or grow a relationship with another man, to take the guidance that he's giving her to build and form a relationship with another man where she's trying to replace him. No dominant man is going to be cool with that, right? Now, you may have a cuckold who's cool with it, but no dominant man is going to be cool with it. You may have an integrated man who's going to allow that situation to burn out and then allow that energy to be transmuted unconsciously. But most men are not going to be on that integrated level, and they can probably just find somebody better to deal with in the first place than to have to put up with that if you're on that level of integration, right? So it's very important to understand what's going on here. Very important to understand what's going on here. Very important. So, like I said, it's different ways that those dom-sub dynamics work. You can't serve two masters, but you have to understand energy transmutation, right? Like I said, an integrated man may take that rejection to not view it as rejection, to use that as motivation to actually make himself more attractive, right? Very important concept to understand, right? But you have to get beyond your insecurities, because you can't encourage somebody to do something that makes them less attractive to you and then also be the leader, or to be in a position of influence within a relationship. So within a feminine submissive, if her animus is developed enough, then her animus will be masculine dominant. Therefore, she will encourage her man to do more things that are masculine and dominant. Therefore, the things she encourages her man to do or adds counsel to will actually make him more attractive to her, creating a cycle of energy that will perpetuate both the safety and the attraction moving forward throughout the course of that relationship. Very important concept to understand. Very important concept to understand. This is where the power and the foundation of sexual energy transmutation is one of the most powerful things. Because when you understand these concepts, then you're able to look at relationships in a different way, but you have to integrate the shadow, right? Let's say a woman has a father complex, and let's say that she is very much views herself and views life and her perspectives and outlooks from a point of view of being principled and moral, very moral based, but let's say those morals are based off an animus that's not holistic, it's not integrated, so it's either so it's very much based on this gentleman concept. If you don't integrate the sexual shadow into a loving relationship, then you are setting yourself up for sexual duplicity. Sometimes when a woman does that, if she has very strong willpower, very strong morals, then she will simply repress all of her sexuality if she doesn't have complete freedom. If she doesn't have complete freedom to do whatever, then she'll repress it all. But that's not good enough. It actually has to be integrated with that primary partner. Transmutation is what allows that, right? Because then you end up like the story I told about that woman I saw in that interview. I think is a great example of the glow up principle. I probably need to make a video directly about that concept. I made one about glow up principle, but directly about that video. If you do not integrate the sexual shadow into your relationships, if you do not integrate your submissive ego into your relationships, then you are setting yourself up to have an experience where someone who is playing with you can be the individual who you experience that with for the first time, and that can create a non-stick principle where you forget all about and lose all your priorities with something that may only last a couple of days or a couple of weeks or maybe a year. I think they say most limerence lasts about 18 months to 3 years, but you will sabotage something that could possibly be very good for you, right? Very much so. So understand that feminine submissive for a woman is going to start more so from the sexual desire, and it's going to branch out from there, right? The integrated feminine has the capacity of starting with the non-sexual connection and then being able to use the non-sexual connection and to transmute that into sexual energy that pushes her above, right? That pushes her to be more attached, because the feminine investment from the submissive ego is what leads to the attachment, right? That's what leads to being further invested in a way that makes you want to cling to an individual. It's the intrinsic desire to give up your submissive ego. So just doing the act of having sex but without the desire being present isn't something that actually leads to it. It actually leads to resentment. It leads to feelings of pressure. It leads to feelings of things not working out. And then it creates a negative feedback loop as far as the emotional experience of what's taking place, which ultimately kills safety, and it starts to deaden for the man his dominant empathy, and for the woman it deadens her submissive empathy, where you're no longer able to truly operate from a place of desire. It becomes a hard skill and a chore that has to be done in order to keep the peace, right? So part of it is respecting principles versus protecting feelings. So this is Coach Brody on Repression Vs Transmutation. I'm out.